Imagine you're one of 4 astronauts strapped into the Orion capsule on April 1st, 2026. You've just flown farther from Earth than any human in history. 252,756 miles past the dark side of the Moon, deeper into space than even Apollo 13 made it. The mission is flawless. The world is watching. And when you splash down in the Pacific 10 days later, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman is standing on the deck, calling it the beginning of a new golden age of exploration. You'd think the path from here to the Moon's surface would be obvious, direct, inevitable. But what NASA actually announced next was one of the strangest pivots in the history of human spaceflight. Artemis III, the mission that was supposed to land 2 astronauts on the lunar South Pole, was quietly scrapped as a landing mission. Instead, it was converted into a test flight in Earth orbit, with the first actual moon landing pushed to Artemis IV in 2028. And the people cheering the loudest are the ones who don't realize what that decision is actually going to cost. This is what you could call the NASA delay spiral. A pattern most people don't notice because it unfolds over years rather than days. And you'd think that after a mission as successful as Artemis II, we'd be accelerating, that we'd be pointing everything at the Moon and saying, next stop, surface. But the complete opposite is happening. Artemis II flew in April 2026. Artemis III, now an Earth orbit test, is planned for mid-2027. Artemis IV, the first actual lunar landing, isn't until early 2028, and Artemis V comes late 2028. So, between a human being touching the Moon's surface and the high of Artemis II, there are over 2 full years. 2 years of delays baked directly into the plan. And the question nobody seems to be asking loud enough is, why is that acceptable? And what does it actually cost us? To understand why this plan is a mistake, let's look at the most blatant problem hiding inside it, the SLS rocket itself. And I know what you're thinking. SLS just carried 4 humans farther into space than anyone has been in 54 years. It worked. It's proven. Why would that be the problem? Here's what's really going on. NASA's own Inspector General found that the first 4 Artemis missions will each cost $4.1 billion per launch, and that figure only covers production and ground operations. It doesn't include the development costs to get the program to this point. For context, total SLS development costs hit $31.6 billion by 2025. That's before a single astronaut has set foot on the Moon. Now here's where it gets genuinely painful. SpaceX's New Glenn rocket, announced in late 2025, offers lift capacity approaching that of the SLS Block 1 while retaining a reusable first stage, and could cost less than 1/10 as much per launch. The rocket NASA is spending $4 billion per flight to use is simultaneously being flanked by commercial vehicles that cost a fraction of the price. And that's the mechanism behind this whole problem. Every time the SLS flies, or doesn't fly on schedule, it burns through money that could be accelerating the actual mission. NASA isn't just spending more than it needs to. It's spending so much that the delay spiral becomes self-reinforcing. A Government Accountability Office report found that the time to produce each successive SLS vehicle is actually increasing. And when a project is delayed, costs rise even further. This is why Artemis III became a test mission instead of a landing. NASA needed another flight just to rehearse the systems it can't afford to get wrong on a $4 billion vehicle. But that's just the cost problem. The complications go much deeper. Take what happened to Artemis III's original mission design. In January 2026, NASA officially delayed Artemis III to no earlier than 2028, and then in late February they expedited it to 2027, but removed the moon landing entirely. Instead, It will now test rendezvous and docking in low Earth orbit with SpaceX's Starship HLS and Blue Origin's Blue Moon landers. Think about that for a second. NASA took a mission that was supposed to make history, the first human moon landing since 1972, and turned it into a docking test in Earth orbit. Not because there was a catastrophic failure, because the landers and spacesuits weren't ready. NASA also abandoned plans to upgrade the SLS to its more capable Block 1B configuration. The Exploration Upper Stage and Mobile Launcher 2, both of which faced years of development delays, were scrapped entirely, with the agency settling for a standardized Block 1 design going forward. So the rocket isn't just expensive, its planned upgrade path was also cancelled. The tool NASA is betting the entire lunar program on is simultaneously frozen in capability. And then there's the heat shield issue that almost derailed Artemis II before it even launched. During the Artemis I mission, the Orion capsule's ablative heat shield experienced greater than expected erosion during re-entry. NASA spent over a year diagnosing the root cause, which turned out to be trapped gases causing internal pressure and uneven shedding of the outer layer. For Artemis II, they chose not to redesign the heat shield, instead changing the re-entry trajectory to reduce the stress on it. Design changes addressing the permeability of the ablative material are planned for the heat shield on Artemis III. That's not a sign of a program running with confidence. That's a program threading needles. Now here's where the people defending NASA's plan push back. What you're describing isn't a mistake. It's prudence. You don't rush a crude lunar landing. You test each system step by step. That's the same way Apollo built up from Apollo 7 through 10 before Apollo 11. Isn't inserting an extra Earth orbit test mission exactly what a responsible space agency should do? And honestly, that argument is right in a vacuum. NASA's own associate administrator made exactly this case. The entire sequence of Artemis flights needs to represent a step-by-step buildup of capability, with each step bringing us closer to our ability to perform the landing missions. Each step needs to be big enough to make progress, but not so big that we take unnecessary risk. The problem is, this isn't a vacuum. NASA isn't operating in an environment where time is free and patience is the only variable. There's a second clock running, and NASA's leadership knows it. China has built a human space program with a clear goal: landing astronauts on the moon by 2030 and starting a base there in the following years. And unlike NASA's program, which has changed direction with nearly every administration since Apollo ended, China's campaign is the outgrowth of a plan called Project 921, first backed by the Chinese Communist Party in 1992. And they have pretty much stuck to it ever since. China has already performed a key test that the US is still working to achieve. The Lanyu lunar lander completed propulsive lunar landing and lunar launch tests in simulated moon gravity conditions. Their lander hardware has been tested. Meanwhile, NASA is still figuring out which commercial lander, SpaceX's Starship HLS or Blue Origin's Blue Moon, is actually ready enough to dock with in Earth orbit, let alone carry crew to the surface. One analyst put it bluntly. Ironically, today, China's effort resembles the 1960s US Apollo moon program more, while the US Artemis program resembles the Soviet Union's competing design bureaus of the late 1960s. That comparison is brutal. The Soviets, with their fragmented multi-bureau approach, never made it to the moon. America did, because it had a singular, concentrated program, and right now, the centralized program is theirs, not ours. NASA Administrator Isaac Mann himself said it. The clock is running in this great power competition, and success or failure will be measured in months, not years. The man running NASA is warning that months matter, And then the plan he announced adds 2 years between Artemis II and the first boots on the moon. Here's the part that almost nobody is saying clearly. The moon isn't just a scientific destination. The competition is ultimately about who gets to control the lunar surface. Whoever controls access to the lunar surface and lunar resources will, for all practical purposes, own the moon. The South Pole in particular, where Artemis IV is targeting, is where permanently shadowed craters almost certainly hold water ice. Water that becomes rocket fuel. Rocket fuel that becomes the logistics backbone of every mission beyond Earth to Mars and eventually further. Both China and the US are shaping the governance of lunar activity. The US-led Artemis Accords framework is being countered by the China-Russia-backed International Lunar Research Station initiative. Two notable exceptions to the Artemis Accords, China and Russia. Whoever physically establishes presence and infrastructure at the South Pole first has enormous leverage over how those governance disputes get resolved. The $4.1 billion per launch isn't just expensive, it's structurally limiting. At that cost, NASA can afford roughly 1 mission per year at best. NASA's own plan calls for at least 1 surface landing every year eventually. But each launch is a $4.1 billion event that must be justified on its own merits, and a history of shifting timelines means any technical setback can derail years of planning and budgeting. The strength of the Artemis architecture, that it uses proven, human-rated hardware, is also its fatal weakness. It is too expensive and too slow to sustain the kind of cadence that actually establishes a presence. NASA built the most powerful rocket to carry humans since the Saturn V, flew it perfectly, and produced one of the most inspiring moments in spaceflight in a generation. And then, instead of riding that momentum directly to the moon's surface, it turned the next mission into a parking lot test. The mistake isn't that NASA is being careful. The mistake is confusing caution with strategy, while the only competitor that matters is operating with exactly the clarity and consistency that Apollo had, except it's them this time, not us. History doesn't remember who was the most deliberate. It remembers who got there. Thanks for watching. And if you want to understand what's actually waiting for us at the moon's South Pole, why water ice there might be worth more than anything we've ever found in space, check out that video here. It changes how you think about why this race even matters.